We would have done this the morning after, but even in the primary, after the New Jersey primary, we anticipated, actually at Colleen O'Dea's suggestion, that we weren't going to have full returns by that Wednesday morning in June. And so we postponed it to not do it immediately after the election. This time, that also seemed true. And it seemed like if we waited a week or so, we'd have a little more perspective, at least, on what the outcome of the 2020 election was and what its implications were going forward. We've invited a distinguished panel here to talk about these issues, to try to talk about what happened both in New Jersey and nationally, and what the implications are of what happened. We have a question and answer. The question and answer tab on the screen will be open, and any of you want to write in questions during the course of the opening remarks, please do so, and we'll try to answer or respond to as many as we can. There are, I gather, 300 people watching this at the moment, so we are unlikely to be able to get to everyone's question. I do want to note that we've had different panelists over the years. Several of the people here have been on the program several times before. Our star alumnus at the moment must be Steve Kornacki, who was on this panel numerous times, but seems to have another gig at the moment, so we did not invite him back here today. So with that, I want to introduce our first panelists and ask each of the panelists to reflect a little bit on what was most interesting to them or struck them about this election, and maybe hit on some things that haven't been talked about so much by the media and other places. I do want to mention one other thing, that we are recording this session, so it will be available on the Eagleton Institute of Politics website for you or anyone else who wants to see it. So again, thank you for joining us. I hope you got yourself a cup of coffee. We couldn't provide one this morning to everybody. And I want to begin by welcoming Colleen O'Dea. Colleen is a reporter and editor at large at NJ Spotlight, and is here today to talk about the election. Colleen, welcome.
Thank you very much, John. It's nice to be here again, chatting about the election with you and with everybody else. You know, I'll say a couple things that I think others have said, just because I can't believe it took me so long to think about that. One of which is Kamala Harris as vice president. It just seems so crazy to me that this is really historic, having a woman finally to, you know, in the White House, or in, I guess, the old executive office building, and you know, having a Black woman with, you know, and South Asian. But this is not, I mean, I completely, you know, glossed over this when David and I were chatting on Saturday night, because, you know, everything else, all of the craziness was kind of just sucking all the air out of the room. So I mean, clearly, it's an amazing thing, and it's a good feeling for women, I think, to, I hope it is. It certainly is for me to have a woman finally, you know, finally in the White House, or a heartbeat away from the White House, let's say. And one of the things I want to say about New Jersey results that I don't think a lot of people have noticed, and these are still coming in. New Jersey is one of the slowest states to count at the moment, at least according to, you know, Washington Post and New York Times results. You know, that's because we had an amazing, it's 4.3 million. It's going to go higher, people who voted. We still don't know what that is going to be as a percentage of those registered, but it's certainly going to be, you know, close to a record-breaking. The number is record-breaking. But what we had in New Jersey, rather than, you know, nationally, there's this blue shift. That's how we saw Biden be able to overtake Trump in other states. What we had is a red shift, and that's because Republicans initially were not embracing vote by mail, and they, you know, also were more likely, it seems, to go to the polls, at least in some places. We haven't seen those provisional ballots yet. They won't start to be counted until tomorrow. In cities, I'm expecting that we're going to have some some bigger Democrat numbers, again, because there were a lot of people that we talked to on election day who said they wanted to make sure their vote counted, so they actually wanted to physically go and cast it. They didn't trust even the drop boxes that were so popular with others. But a lot of the later mail-in ballots that have come in have been from Republicans, and we're expecting that there'll be Republican turnout in some other, in many other locations. So we've seen the, Biden still is overwhelmingly winning New Jersey, but we've seen a race like the Tom Malinowski, Tom Kaine race narrow quite a bit from, I think it was 9 points to now about 5 points, or maybe less than 5 points. So, so that was something that was unique to New Jersey.
Thank you. David Cruz from NJTV, which is now part of New Jersey Spotlight, a senior correspondent and also the moderator of Reporters Roundtable, and now of Chatbox also on NJTV.
Yes, I would say that we are NJ Spotlight and we are one big mashup. Neither is part of the other, yet we are all together. That sounds like a Beatles tune, I think, right?
Yes, right.
But it's great to see Colleen, who is becoming a television rock star, we should note, by her appearances on NJ Spotlight News. And it's nice to be with all of you today. This is a week that has felt like a month, especially if you're in the news business. This is the kind of stuff that, even when we did 3 hours of live coverage on election night, and you've got 3 hours of pent up energy that you have to get rid of after you do anything live. So Tuesday became Wednesday quite quickly for me. And then the rest of the week flew by as well. We ended up doing a live show on Saturday night when Joe Biden was declared the winner. And so I have done nothing but discuss this race and its aftermath for an entire week now. And I've really switched between laughter and dread because the democracy is at stake. And this is a president who has up to today said that he is not yet willing or ready to concede and has almost weaponized part of the government to oversee these election results. So that has me dreading things. But then just seeing the jubilation over the weekend, partisan as it was, made me feel good about people feeling good about America, as opposed to bashing one another philosophically or on any other number of issues, as important as it is to do that. But just for an old guy like me, just seeing people out celebrating and hugging, there was a great scene of a demonstration outside of City Hall in Jersey City where the postman came to take the mail out of the box and take it onto the truck, and the people surrounded him and were chanting and cheering him, and one woman grabbed them and gave him a hug, which to me was just like, wow, that's the first time I've ever seen that in my life. But that was kind of spontaneous, and that kind of made me feel good. And then I laughed when I saw the press conference that Rudy Giuliani and cohorts held in front of a landscaping business that looked like any run-of-the-mill little city council race in Jersey, like the smallest town. That's what it looked like to me. And so, and it felt like an episode of the show Veep, where it was the wildest cast of characters. All of that aside, to say that this whole process has left me with more questions than answers. Let's assume right now that Joe Biden is the president elect. There are so many things to talk about in terms of what comes from a Biden administration. What is the influence of people of color who even the president-elect acknowledged on Saturday that saved him, saved his bacon, as it were, in South Carolina, and now through the general election. What is the impact of that? What are the real repercussions of that in terms of an agenda for people of color, Black women particularly? And it made me wonder if Kamala Harris is going to be put in an enviable position of having to be the minority part of this ticket who handles all of those kind of requests, as it were. I got a little sense of that because on Saturday, Joe Biden spoke very broadly. It was Kamala Harris who spoke to the specific groups who made up this Democratic coalition that elected him. So that is something that I wonder about. I also wonder, what is the impact of this president on the presidency, on how we perceive it? And has he changed it forever by the things that he has done and has been able to get away with? The presidency has always been a very powerful position. I mean, that sounds like an understatement, but beyond what we think of its power, it really has the power to become quite authoritarian. And this is a president who took us right to the brink of that. What will other presidents feel emboldened to do? And have we, as a result of the way that this president has shaken confidence in our institutions, is our democracy strong enough to handle someone who may want to be even more authoritarian than this guy? I think of our institutions that have been under attack, the press, not the least of them over the last 4 years, but our very electoral system, our confidence in ICE, our confidence in the CDC, our confidence in the FBI, the US Postal Service, all of those things, chipping away at the efficacy of those things hurts a democracy. And so that has me concerned as well. And in New Jersey, just 2 points that I would make that I'm looking at is, one, I can't believe that we haven't counted all our votes yet. That if we were a swing state, I mean, this would be a scandal. So how do we fix that system so that we can not only vote by mail much more easily, but also just participate in any other ways electorally that our technology helps to develop? Right now, we ain't there. And then lastly, just as a political thing, I wonder what the defeat of Trump, what the impact of that is on the New Jersey Republican Party. With a gubernatorial race coming next year, I think that it's going to be interesting to see where the GOP, the Republicans in New Jersey, go. Are they a party of Trump? Or are they the moderate Republicans that have traditionally held sway in New Jersey? I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's where my head is at right now.
I think that those are some great questions to get on the table for this discussion. I would say, I think in terms of Kamala Harris, regardless of what she said, the fact that she spoke on Saturday was extremely unusual. I don't know if when a president has essentially a victory speech, it's rare, if ever, that the vice president is also speaking.
Yeah.
It's worth. Let me call next on Nabila Baptiste, who was the state, I guess maybe still is, the New Jersey State Director for the Biden for President campaign. Congratulations.
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, John. I will be for the next 5 days and then
Okay.
so until Friday. But thank you so much for having me and giving me this platform. I do want to, I think Colleen touched on an important thing with Kamala. There's a quote that you can't be what you can't see. And so to have a woman who is a woman, Black, Indian descent, and in that power, it just gives a whole new generation of girls something to look up to, which is something very profound and important. So to have her in there and her speech, definitely as a Black and brown person, definitely resonated within me. One thing that I did notice that New Jersey reflects into the national and then back and forth. And one thing that was really unique is the amount of grassroots that rised up for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the state. There are, and I think I would give them a huge credit to why Gloucester flipped and why Morris flipped. For Joe Biden, it's because of these small grassroots organizations that started for phone banking for Joe Biden, for Kamala Harris, for Democrats up and down the ballot here in New Jersey and in these battleground states. So I can't, I can't, do my victory leap without shouting out the grassroots who did definitely help here in New Jersey and our sister states across the nation. I think to David's points about I'm assuming the post office person getting hugged. And I've seen a lot of images of unity, and that is what Joe Biden's America is, and it's something that we haven't seen in 4 years. I think we've seen a lot of division, a lot of anger. And so to see some type of humility and humanity within people just celebrating because this isn't a battle that we won. This isn't a war that we won. We won a battle, and then the true work starts in January 20th. And so to see that after 4 years of a little bit of, not a little bit, but a ton of heartache and heartbreak is very refreshing. I think in January 20th, and to see what I'm excited to see about Joe Biden's administration is how we honor the people of color that got him elected. Honoring them in policy. Joe Biden wouldn't have gotten elected in Arizona without the Latino and indigenous vote. In Detroit, in Detroit, Philly, Atlanta, it's the Black vote, especially the Black woman vote. The Black women organizing and mobilizing folks to go out and register to vote and voting for Joe and Kamala and Democrats up and down the ballot. So I'm really excited to see how they, what their first 100 days will look like, how their team will look like, and how these conversations within the Democratic apparatus will be come, January 20th.
Okay, thank you. Well, next, Mike DuHaime is a veteran of many Republican campaigns at all levels of government and is a partner in Mercury Public Affairs. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Mike is also a professor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics.
Yeah, this is my first. It's my first of 2 visits to Eagleton today. I've got class later tonight, so I'll be back in front of the computer later. I would just bring up 2 things and save the rest for discussion. One, there were a remarkable number of disruptive acts going on in the U.S. right now. By disruptive, I mean things that have happened historically that caused change in America. There was a pandemic. There was a recession. There was obviously civil unrest in the streets after the murder of George Floyd. There was a Supreme Court vacancy. When this type of disruption happens, there is generally a change in the top of the ticket. There's generally a change of who's in power. If you just look back to last time there was a pandemic, 1918, 1920, the White House flips. If you look back to 1968 in terms of what was going on, in terms of civil unrest, LBJ didn't even run again during the Vietnam War and what was going on then. Even if you look back to times of less economic upheaval, 1992, 2008, certainly recession, you saw the party in power change. Almost every time you saw something similar to this, you saw the party in power change. And here we had it all going on at once. You didn't just have 1 or 2, you had 4 major things happening here. So somewhat unsurprised that there was a change. I think the president had an opportunity when the pandemic first started to potentially work with Democrats, especially in states that were important to the Electoral College, Democratic governors in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and to work with them, and they would have embraced him because they needed his help. We look back to Governor Christie and President Obama during 2012, when there are times when people come together and it's generally beneficial to both. The president didn't have that. Look at some of the nice things that Governor Murphy and Governor Cuomo said about Donald Trump during the pandemic when they were in desperate need of help from the federal government. You could have had that. The president chose not to do that. It was probably an opportunity there. you had this major disruption. So not really a surprise to me that there would be a change in power. I think what's probably surprising to many of us is that everything below that is relatively status quo. And so it is somewhat remarkable. One, the polls are completely off, and we can talk about that, at some point if you want, my opinion on it. But there's people who do polls for publicity are very different than people who do polls for to find out actually what's going on and to change elections. I would just to talk about the status quo. Democrats only picked up 1 seat in the U.S. Senate, at least at this point. There'll be 2 runoffs. But obviously, many of the races that looked like we're going to go Democrat didn't. Republicans actually picked up seats in the House. So the Democrats still have a majority in the House, although it's much smaller. State legislative chambers, only 2 in the entire country flipped, and they're both in New Hampshire. Every other state stayed exactly the same, and only 1 governorship changed as well, and that actually went Republican. So it's interesting to see. You see this shift, actually a little bit to the right everywhere else, while the presidency, which was obviously the most important and biggest prize, went to the left. So it's just a very interesting, this is a deeply divided country, and we can talk about many of the reasons why it is and reflect about it, but also reflect on what is missed by people who only find derision in people that they disagree with, and to understand what they miss rather than kind of mocking those they disagree with, or being condescending, what actually drives people. So I just think, to me, it was remarkable, and I think somewhat surprising about the relative lack of movement beneath the presidency in terms of what happens in America. America basically said, we want things to be basically the same, except get that guy out of the White House. That I can't take. But everything else they kind of asked for same. America likes divided government. We don't want anybody, with too much control or too much power, it seems. And it was another change election, but change at the top, but that didn't mean to change anything else. So I find that interesting, and we can all unpack that as we go forward. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Mike. Next, Patricia Campos-Medina is political strategist and the immediate past president of Latinas United for Political Empowerment. Welcome, Patricia.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me and inviting me to be part of this discussion. I am the president of LUPE Action, which is Latinas United for Political Empowerment and Education and Voter Mobilization outfit of LUPE. So what stood out for me in this election? From the beginning, as a Latina, as an immigrant, as a labor leader, because that's my background, we were, yes, facing a number of different attacks in our communities. From the pandemic that had basically attacked communities of color in greater numbers, from our low-wage workers who became essential workers and were suffering the worst effects of the pandemic and the lack of protections from OSHA, from our immigrant families who were being torn apart by the weaponization of ICE and the attacks in our communities, from the lack of relief for immigrant workers in many of our states. So many of us who were organizing the immigrant and the Latino community felt like our bodies were on the line. And that exacerbated with the uprising of Black Lives Matter over the summer. It made us feel like this was a culmination of a series of attacks that the Trump administration had waged against poor people, against immigrants, and against essential workers across this country. So our body was on the line. We were committed to turning out and voting. So with that said, I am relieved, that I feel like Van Jones when he said it feels good this morning to be a mother, a parent, because I could finally tell my kids, your vote counts. And the system of democracy that we have embraced in this country as immigrants survived Donald Trump. Democracy survived Donald Trump, and the system of check and balances survived Donald Trump. And I could tell my kids that it doesn't matter, what a politician does, we can hold him accountable when we vote. And for me, elevating that message is so important. So now, what happened with the immigrant vote and with the Latino vote across this country? The Latino vote has always been a vote that swings either Republican or Democrat. But since Donald Trump came in power, he basically turned the vote Democratic. And the fact that many Republicans couldn't separate themselves from the attacks of his presidency against immigrants and against Puerto Ricans. Remember, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They are not immigrants. And to lump all of us in one pot, I think that was a big disservice to the Republican Party. And we saw that in the way in New Jersey as well. I mean, the fact that King Jr. couldn't make a dent on Tom Malinowski, on my district, I live in Hunterdon County, it shows that the centrist message that New Jersey Republicans used to have, they had lost it for now, because there's no credibility on them as being centrist or standing up for what is right over what is a message of bigotry against from Trump and the Republican Party. So they have a lot of room to fix there. Now, nationally, Latinos voted 70% for Biden. What surprised me, and I still, surprised me with the media and with the pundits, is that this idea that this is something new, that Trump gaining some votes from some of the Mexican pockets in the border, or gaining some, or keeping the Cuban vote or the Venezuelan vote in Florida, or keeping second or third generation Mexicans vote, that somehow that is news. That has always been a vote that Republicans could get. What we need to figure out as Latinos who are trying to build a Latino political base is how do we push our political parties, both Republican and Democrats, to target our community and invest in our community in a more targeted way, and not assume that every Latino vote cares about immigration. Don't assume that every Latino vote is a single voter issue person. So that is a challenge that we're gonna have to revisit. Latinos are susceptible, they swing back and forth because depending on whether it's third, fourth generation, whether they're evangelicals or they're Catholic or they're not, they swing that way. And whether, what is the position that we're gonna have in regards to Puerto Rico? That is a big vote here in New Jersey that we still have to figure out how we're going to coalesce coming in the upcoming election. So those are things that stood out to me, this lack of understanding of the type of investment that needs to happen in the Latino vote, and that will have repercussions for the New Jersey gubernatorial race, because there's very little investment in the Latino vote in New Jersey in between in every election. And how Governor Murphy in response to that challenge, I think it will be important for us to see. How do we engage the expatriates of Puerto Rico who have come here and have very specific needs that are not the same needs of immigrants in New Jersey? How do we respond to the lack of relief for all, for immigrants, essential workers in New Jersey? That is an issue that we're gonna have to resolve here in New Jersey. And how do we address the legalization of cannabis? I mean, that's a big issue for urban communities, Latinos and Blacks. And the fact that the legislature, after we legalize, is now taking up the tax component of it, and without any considerations for the implications that that piece of legislation has to urban Black and Latino voters, will have repercussions. So how we create a coalition going into 2021 for the gubernatorial race. So that's one of the things that are in my mind right now. I am glad the system survived Donald Trump. I am glad our democracy is alive. We have a lot of work to do to make sure that it stays that way. But we, just like Blacks deliver support for Biden, Latinos were key in turning Arizona, in keeping Nevada, in keeping Virginia, and in Pennsylvania. The 5% of Latino voters who voted were key in also delivering this White House to Biden. But we are not a monolithic vote, and we cannot be taken for granted. And I hope that that's the lesson that both parties get from this election.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist, Regina Egea, is the president of Garden State Initiative. Welcome, Regina.
Thanks, John. Yeah, at Garden State Initiative, we focus on fiscal matters, so a slightly different bent from some of the prior comments, but also looking at the context of this election, and actually do a short summary on a few states that had fiscal matters on their ballots in light of this election, and kind of what that can tell us about New Jersey. And then I'll make a few comments about New Jersey's economy and going forward from what we can gather from the other states. So and interestingly enough, to polling, I'll talk about, and how polling predicted one thing, but voters said something quite different. So in California, voters, in contradiction to public polling, actually rejected Prop 15, which would have raised business taxes, business property taxes, by revoking part of their landmark Prop 13. Voters saw it as an opportunity to raise residential property taxes, to which they stay firmly opposed. And also in California, in spite of going 2-to-1 for President-elect Biden, voters also endorsed Prop 22, which was defining gig workers as contractors. So you can see in California that there's a desire to, say no to regulation that stifles innovation, but say yes to keeping costs in check. Now in Illinois and Arizona, there were ballot initiatives about tax fairness. In Arizona, one of the most hotly contested, as we know, presidential states, they approved a ballot measure for $1 billion to spend in education, but only by low single digits, and was expected to carry with a double-digit margin. And notably, even with a 3.5% surcharge on the top earners in Arizona, they remain still 25% lower in income tax bracket than New Jersey. And Arizona's economy is one of the fastest growing in 19, and they have a low unemployment rate. Now, Illinois, Governor Pritzker and the legislation wanted to raise $3.5 billion in revenue by increasing taxes on $250,000 earners and above. And now the opposite of President-elect Biden's win margin of 13 points, voters rejected a change to their constitution, which actually has a flat tax rate for income in the state. And also polling indicated that it should have won by a 2-to-3 margin. And Illinois is often placed in the same bracket as New Jersey in terms of high taxes and high cost of living, as well as a sluggish economy. And the fiscal performance is bearing that out and is less than the average in the United States. And we are very similar in terms of fiscal performance to Illinois. Now, the last last state I'll do a contrast with is actually a little bit of a different angle. Also a state that President-elect Biden won was Colorado. And Colorado's Democratic Governor Polis supported Proposition 116, which cut income taxes for individuals and for C Corps. And that amendment passed with a 16-point margin. Polis had implemented cost savings earlier in the spring when the COVID was coming forward to avoid tax hikes. Colorado's economy continues to grow and be one of the fastest growing, as well as a low unemployment rate. So the takeaways looking at the other states, I think, are twofold. One is, much as some of the prior comments, like these states are not monoliths, even though they may vote one way at the federal level. When you look at state fiscal matters, sometimes they have very different attitudes. And number two, I think polling in these matters doesn't seem to really get underneath the attitudes on fiscal matters inside the states. And it's something that we have to keep an eye on. So what does this mean for New Jersey? From an economic perspective, which is really what GSI spends time on. First, we've had a measurable recovery. More than half the jobs have come back from pre-March. Our low unemployment rate, though, is really a reflection of individuals who have become discouraged, and we have a relatively, actually a 44-year low labor participation rate in New Jersey at 61.4%. So it's something that we have to continue to encourage job growth to be able to bring those workers back into the workplace. Residential real estate has certainly benefited from the escape from New York, but with more flexible work arrangements, and especially for the higher earning, I think, technical positions, and the more flexibility for work location, I think we'll have to watch that and see if that trend of real estate upswing isn't challenged because of those new work arrangements. And then lastly, maybe of greater concern and probably much more in our collective control, is that New Jersey as a government has done much less belt tightening than other states. And we're consistently proposing higher taxes and borrowing. And I think that impacts our longer term growth prospects. As demonstrated in other states, wisely structured cost reductions, along with tax that are flat or reducing, are popular even in other blue states. And it's something to keep in the front of our minds as we go into 2021 and understand the landscape as well as what polling can and can't tell us. So bottom line, I think New Jersey's growth rate will return to where we were previous to the election, which is lagging, frankly, the rest of the United States. And we're lagging Pennsylvania, which is, I'll remind everyone, the #1 state for New Jerseyans when they leave. So without more competitive, I think, policies will continue to have an unemployment rate not materially change from the 6.7% that we have now through the rest of 21 and maybe even into 22. So since we don't, allow initiatives, but initiated by the public, that is, on the ballot in New Jersey, the way we express our policy choices, as opposed to some other states, is by voting for candidates. So that's why it's essential as we go into the voting for 21, where both the Assembly and the Senate, as well as the governorship, is on the ballot, that we really examine the tax and fiscal policies of each candidate. And we're committed to helping voters really examine these policies and think about the impact of those voter choices in 2021. So with that, I'll stop, and thanks, John. I'll take questions as we go forward. Thank
you all. Certainly put a lot of issues out on the table. Let me start by taking one of the questions from the Q&A box and expanding it a little bit to ask anyone's thoughts about the New Jersey congressional delegation. We have 5 of our 12 members who have are finishing either their first or second term. It appears that all of them have won. I guess the Van Drew Amy Kennedy race is, I'm not sure if that she's conceded, but it looks like Van Drew's going to win. What's the significance of that? These are 4 of them are people who were elected in the blue wave of 2018, and they all seem to have survived into a second term. There is the adage that you're not elected until you're reelected. Well, now they've been reelected. And what's that mean going forward?
I think that there were some of the pundits said, as we were going through this process, that while there were swings in the second, although that swung back because of the decision that Jeff Van Drew made not to support impeachment and then to join the Republican Party, in the third, in the 7th, and the 11th, that certainly, at least they thought in the 11th and the 7th, that those, and potentially in the 3rd, that those would be perhaps permanently blue now. I'm not sure that says this because, in 2 years we have a midterm election coming up. In the midterms, quite often you see that the party in power loses seats. So it may be even tougher for those to stay at that point. I think there wasn't a lot of polling or outside polling done, not internal campaign polling. But it certainly seems that in the 2nd district, again, as we keep talking about the polls not being accurate, that didn't follow through. There's also the question about Craig Calloway down there, the man who a convicted felon who got involved. He's been involved with the Democrats before, but Van Drew hired him, and what influence he may have had. Kennedy needed to win big in Atlantic County, and that hasn't happened. I mean, she may get some provisional votes coming in, but she has conceded. Nobody thinks that race is going to switch now. So, and again, as I said earlier, the Kaine-Malinowski race keeps tightening. So I know the Republicans haven't conceded there. AP seems to think that Malinowski's going to take it. So do the Democrats. I'm guessing it's not going to flip back, but it is interesting to see that tightening. So we'll have to wait and see, I think, until the midterm that's coming up to see if in fact those seats really have now, at least the blue ones, have become perhaps permanently blue. We also are going to have one last point. We also are going to have another redistricting happen, and so it's going to be, some have said that the Amy Kennedy losing was something of a gift maybe to the Democrats, because trying to to keep the seats that they have currently blue, and also arrange a second district to be blue would be really, really difficult.
I would say we don't need to overthink the analysis of the congressional races. The state was 6-6 for 6 years before Donald Trump. It was 7-6 in either direction for decades before that. And after Donald Trump, it's 11-1. It switched to 10-2 and Jeff Van Drew. It's Donald Trump. New Jersey does not like him. What works for Donald Trump in places like Wisconsin and Iowa doesn't work here. We have a different makeup of our diverse electorate, and it's that simple. And I agree with Colleen in that there's going to be redistricting. It's going to be a Biden midterm, and the redistricting, the way it works in New Jersey, assuming we don't lose a seat, the several safe districts actually are going to physically have to grow. The Payne seat and the Pascrell seat are ones who don't, the population doesn't grow as fast. So it's actually those more moderate seats or more competitive seats that are actually going to change a bit more, and potentially even, change a little bit more to the Republicans. And so what happens in Congress and how far left Congress goes is going to impact. And I think our delegation, especially given the more centrist Democrats, or at least want to be perceived as centrist Democrats, are going to have a real influence in a very tightly contested Congress. There's not a big majority in there. So, if you will, more moderate Democrats, whether it's just from New Jersey or elsewhere, are going to have a real say in terms of what the Democratic Party goes into.
I do want to echo Colleen and Mike in terms of New Jersey that didn't like Donald Trump, and that therefore that's reflected on a congressional delegation that we're sending back. But I do think that there were some changes that we ought to elevate in terms of what's happening in Morris County, in terms of the freeholders' rates and who's voting there. What happened in Somerset and how the Democrats did gain some ground in that county, and what's happening also in Atlantic County overall. We have a Latina running countywide that might have an opportunity to be elected. So the fact that counties are changing, it reflects a shift on the population of who's moving into these areas, and it's mostly voters of color, urban dwellers that are coming, people who are moving to these areas and changing the makeup of our party in New Jersey. And I think that will have repercussions for the next decades. Now, that also ought to influence the redistricting fight that is coming. As you know, there has been a huge growth of Latino voters and Asian voters, counting Indian Americans and Korean and Asians, not just in the community, that we ought to see a higher representation of them in the legislative map in New Jersey. So I think that the Democrats have some reckoning to do in terms of who will be on the redistricting commission. It's the same with Republicans. I mean, it's not a one-party responsibility to have a map that reflects the population in New Jersey. But for us who have been, for our community has been increasingly brought in blue, I think we are expecting the Democratic Party to be more inclusive of those votes that are giving them the opportunity to grow in places that they could have never had thought to grow, like Morris County, Somerset County, and even Atlantic County, I will say. So redistricting is the fight that will determine how inclusive Democrats want to be in New Jersey.
One thing I noticed, and I don't know if this is trivial, but so I'll raise it anyway, is if you look at our congressional delegation in terms of those who've been in office in the House 3 terms or more, almost all of them came out of the state legislature. Look at the 5 new ones. None of them came out of the legislature except Jeff Van Drew. If Amy Kennedy had won, they all would have found a different path in. And I wonder if that says anything to an aspiring member of Congress or activist group, that maybe picking a state legislator is not the best course, or not automatically the best course toward choosing a future member of Congress.
I would say that in Jeff Van Drew's case, it didn't hurt. Right. I think a lot of his victory was based on the fact that he was a known quantity down there. I mean, notwithstanding what else he might have done, just in terms of the politics of things and who he paid to to gather up vote by mail ballots and so on. That notwithstanding, I think that had a lot to do with Jeff Van Drew's victory, that he was a known quantity having served in the state legislature. Now, I look at a race like in CD8, where in the primary, Hector Egea seemed to come out of nowhere to, at least philosophically, raise a challenge against the incumbent Albiocires. And I think that we need to watch and see where the progressives in the Democratic Party are coming from. And I would say that by and large, they're probably not veterans of state legislatures, et cetera, that they're more from the activist wing of the party. So if they start to have some success, then that will be interesting to watch and see if there's now another route to political power in New Jersey, and that route may be the grassroots. Depends on how strong the party is, and if the leader of that party allows for that kind of progression, which I think is a challenge that Governor Murphy is going to have to face, particularly in the next year.
There are lots of questions on the chat. One that came in before we started was about national media and what's the future of Fox and MSNBC and other, I don't know if there are other CNN, I guess, that had huge spikes in what viewership over the last months and years, and whether that's going to continue and their influence will grow or shrink or change in one way or another, and how all of that affects New Jersey Spotlight.
Well,
the future is bright. Yeah, David. Future is bright financially. They love Donald Trump. CNN made Donald Trump. He could call during the primary in 2016. He would call from his pajamas in Trump Tower and talk for hours on Fox and Friends, and they covered him more than everybody else combined. He makes for good ratings, right? He's a reality TV star. He turned our politics into reality TV, and with that, the ratings went like reality TV, and they went high. They're going to miss him. They're still going to cover him. Fox will still be covering Hillary's emails for a couple more years. Let's not pretend it's anything but it was eyeballs. They wanted eyeballs, and they got them, and Trump delivered them. Fox had the best ratings of any cable system in history this month. CNN had their best month ever. MSNBC had their best prime time ever. So I think they're going to miss Donald Trump. I think both the people who love him and the people who hate him. I think America wants a little bit of boring right now, but that's not going to be necessarily. It's not going to necessarily bring more eyeballs to cable TV. And I'm curious what David and Colleen think more about journalism broadly right now.
For me, I come from the school of CNN and Fox and MSNBC being a blight on journalism, mostly, and it's not even their fault, really, because they're providing entertainment. Their genre of entertainment is politics. But I think it's more incumbent upon us, the consumers of this stuff, to recognize that what you're seeing by and large on MSNBC and Fox is not the practice of journalism. And again, nothing wrong with it. You're doing your thing. But I think we have to recognize that there's more than just Fox News. If Fox News is where we are politically inclined, and the same for MSNBC and CNN and Breitbart, for that matter, right? We have to become much more discreet in how it is that we choose. Where we choose to consume our news. We need to get out of our bubbles. And I think it would be great if part of the mission of journalists was to say, listen, you read this on our site or in our newspaper or on our air. Here's other places where you can get other reliable news. Of course, that's never going to happen because by and large, we're selling soap in the end. The commercial press and media operations are. But I think it's really important that people understand what it is that they're watching and consume things much more critically, even from the sources that we trust. And I don't know that that's going to happen. I think I'm being maybe a little Pollyannish when it comes to that, but I think that that's where we have to go. And there's a real danger in people taking their eyeballs away from legitimate press and legitimate journalism and tuning it to the cotton candy of the MSNBCs and the Foxes.
Yeah, and I would say that I would think that Fox is probably going to do even better, perhaps, just because the folks now who are, who were Trump supporters are going to really want to now kind of have that echo chamber to get their news about the bashing of the Democratic the Democratic elects now. In terms of just overall, yeah, I mean, it's just so disappointing as someone who of a certain age, who saw CNN come in and it was this breath of fresh air, you could get news if you were a news junkie 24/7, but it's not that anymore. It's, it's also, and certainly MSNBC never, I don't think, pretended to be anything but, left leaning. It's disappointing that we've lost that. In terms of, more New Jersey centric news, one of the things that we try to do at Spotlight is we really try to provide that, issue-based reporting and stories that provide context. And we do have links to other places that you can get more information. But we can do that, at least at the moment, we hope, because we are supported by donations and by some foundations. It is really hard, I think, if you read something like at NJ.com or NorthJersey.com, to see these guys are struggling because the paper subscriptions are down, and so they're looking for other ways to make money because it costs money. Good journalism costs money, and so you've got paywalls coming up and you've got clickbait on stories, and that's what a lot of people are looking for, but that's not what the people need. I think it's something that we have balanced for a long time in journalism. What are the people looking for versus what do we think is important to put out there, the kind of stories that I think, Regina's group talks about, and, issues that are, that we think really we'd like to see people reading more about. So it's a struggle, and I don't know where we're going to go. We're just going to keep trying to do our part to do what we think is best.
Let me just mention, I imagine most people watching this are aware of Spotlight, but it's njspotlight.com, and there's really great in-depth coverage of policy issues and affecting New Jersey, in New Jersey. Patricia, you mentioned the marijuana referendum, and I wondered if you could pick up on that a little bit. Those referenda in 5 states, I guess, to legalize or decriminalize marijuana all passed. Your concerns about that or feeling about the implementation of that?
Well, yes, I think that what we saw around the country is this acceptance by American voters that legalization of cannabis and marijuana is the right time to do it, and is the fair thing to do and the right thing to do. And I think that here in New Jersey, the fact that it was overwhelmingly approved by voters, we knew that was going to happen because New Jersey voters have wanted to legalize it, yet elected officials didn't have the courage back then to do it themselves. So the problem that we have in New Jersey now is that we sort of legalized it, but didn't fix the legality of it, and how do we fix some of the problems of who was impacted by the illegality of the consumption of marijuana. So now, the legislature introduced a bill on Monday, basically around taxation, and basically introducing a model that is different from other states, in which taxation is so low, and where that money is going has not been a process of engagement with the civil rights and the social justice organizations who supported the legalization of marijuana for a long time. So I think that they see an opportunity to ram a bill that has not been debated and how, without any input from social justice organizations, and there is a backlash. And I think that if they were really responsible about addressing the social justice concerns of marijuana, they ought to be engaged in those conversations. The bottom line is that we still have a whole generation of African-American men and Latino men who were criminalized by the simple, by selling a small parts of small pieces of marijuana that we ought to have discussed already. How are we going to create reparations for those communities? How are we going to invest in Newark, in towns like Passaic, in towns like Patterson, so that those folks can have opportunity to re-enter society? Also, how are you going to create a system in which Latinos and African Americans enter in the process of the business? Because it's a business. It's not just about social justice. It's a business. And if we don't do the taxation and the regulation correctly, it's going to become another white man industry in which the white man will hold all the power and entry and exit of that industry. So, and that is an issue about wealth creation for Latinos in New Jersey. Not every Latino in New Jersey is undocumented or poor or working class. We have a whole class of business people in New Jersey who want to be in the business of wealth creation in that industry, and there has to be a process to allow them to participate.
Let me put a bunch of questions that have been come in on the table, and you can all make it a grab bag. You can choose or ignore them. What is the process to resolve the refusal of the Trump administration to share or allow GSA access to Biden's team? Here's an easy one. On a broader basis, what should President-elect Biden do about Russia, Iran, China, and their meddling in our elections? How do we explain and understand the results that Trump increased votes among Blacks, especially males, and Latinos? I'll stop there for the moment. Anyone want to jump on any of those?
I'd like to pick up on that last one because it's part of the discussion that we've been having, and I've heard it in other places. In fact, on Chatbox this week, we're going to have a panel of Black women to talk about impact on the election. But also one of the questions is this sense that particularly Black and Latino men, some have gravitated towards Trump. I don't know what the final numbers are yet, but I think that it is something that should be watched in those communities. And Patricia kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. But there is, I think, this gender gap in the Latino community and in the Black community as well, that really reflects the national gender gap in terms of how people see things. And I think that there is, I'll speak for Latinos, this macho aesthetic that is part of our culture that manifests itself sometimes in our politics, in our electoral politics. And there's certain affinity, for lack of a better term, towards authoritarianism. And I think that that's a discussion that needs to be had in the Latino community, and if I dare say, in the Black community as well, because in those communities, the people who are leading the efforts towards empowerment and political power are women, and they are at the forefront of that. And I think that Latino men have to have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then as a community, we need to talk about that and find out what that says about us and how we go about talking to one another across genders.
David, we have some comments asking about outlets for news in New Jersey beyond NJ Spotlight and NJ.com. Can you say something about Chatbox? Because I don't think that's familiar to many people.
Sure. Chatbox is a weekly news program, public affairs program that NJ Spotlight News produces every week. I don't know if you all remember a show called On the Record, which was hosted by Michael Aaron. This show replaces that show, and it really deals with the issues from the State House, but beyond the State House as well, that affect New Jersey in terms of politics and business and government, et cetera.
Thanks. One question specifically for Regina, if you would be open to addressing the financial side of marijuana approval in New Jersey.
Well, I guess I'll talk about the tax. As Patricia noted, the rate is somewhat under discussion and I think under dispute. But, even the most optimistic numbers, at least that I've seen in terms of when it's fully operational, which will take some time. I don't think 2 years is unreasonable for it to really get in and operational. I've heard 200 to 250 million in terms of the revenue generation. And from a state budget perspective, it's helpful, but I would not characterize it as, a solution to some of the other fiscal problems in the state. And it certainly, will drive some mandates at the local level. And I don't know how they've been, really contemplated beyond the initial cost I know that's in there for setting up the commission and, setting up the regulations. So is there anything else you'd want me to comment on that?
I think that's good for the moment if you don't have anything. I should have mentioned at the outset, Mike DuHaime had another engagement and was going to have to leave at 10:30. So I think he's left. Must be 10:30.
Can I just pick up on the tax rate? I just did a story on this yesterday, and we're going to be talking about it during the week as well. Is that some of the initial expectations for annual income and tax revenue were based on this study done by New Jersey Policy Perspective, where the tax rate ended up being in the high teens or even up to 20%. And then that is how those hundreds of millions were generated. As Regina points out, not really much in a $40 billion state budget. But right now the bill allows for whatever the state sales tax is, 6.2 or 6.6, whatever it is. And that's not going to raise a lot of money at all.
Right. And so, it really was intended for all the other reasons that everybody advocated for it. It's really not going to be a fiscal solution.
Yeah.
Hey, John, I would jump in on one of the other questions, which was just about the GSA and say, I'm not sure what can happen at this point. Maybe Nabila has some thoughts about how the Biden, folks plan to proceed, but certainly the last 4 years have shown us all of the problems that we have with our democracy, with the way our systems are running, and all of the ways that we need to improve them. And I guess I would like to think that we hear about Biden having been a senator and having a relationship with Mitch McConnell, so that if he does remain as the majority leader there, that there would be some way to, and I think it benefits both parties really to deal with issues like this, so that they don't come up again in a future administration. I'm not sure how quickly that might, those discussions might happen, but I would certainly expect to see them coming up.
There was a question on the question and answer that I would like to allude to, and it's the issue of the being progressivism impact the ability of the Democratic Party to take back the Senate or gain seats in the House. And I think that, that is, well, what I can say to that is that, for example, the real progressive members of Congress, the squad, they even, they gain one more member of their squad. So the real progressives that identify themselves with the wing of the party with Ocasio-Cortez, they did not lose, they got reelected. The people who lost were those centrist Democrats who were back and forth. They didn't know how to identify themselves and try to keep the middle road. Those lost. So there is a real reckoning of looking in the House and figuring out what is the right message in terms of building power at the congressional level. New Jersey with a blue, I would like to see more progressives being able to run in New Jersey, like the Osegueras of the world, so we can change our politics in terms of the party. But there's a lot of big obstacles institutionally wise, like the Democratic line, the closed primaries, that doesn't allow for a lot of new faces to be run at the local level. But I think that there is a vibrant, progressive wing of the Democratic Party activists in New Jersey that are challenging those basic, the way Democrats run elections in New Jersey, that perhaps in the short term, we are able to see some changes in terms of more progressive running. Now, I think that redistricting is going to should allow for another member of Congress to come out and open up a new seat for the next decade in terms of congressional representation for a minority. And to me, that's where the rubber is going to hit the road in terms of who will be able to rise up, not from just the legislative bench, but from the progressive activist bench of the Democratic Party in New Jersey, because I think that there's a lot of exciting things happening. So in terms of what we're going to do with the Senate, we have Georgia to worry about and hopefully win those 2 seats so that we can actually make some inroads in the Senate. We have very important, big priority items that we want Biden to tackle right away. And we need the Senate to get them done. One of them, of course, is healthcare. One is COVID-19, but we also have immigration reform. We actually have 300,000 TPS holders that are scheduled to be deported by January 2nd because of Donald Trump. And I don't know, Donald Trump might keep the deportation procedures in place. Within 20 days, Biden has to reverse some of those executive orders. And then we got to work in the Senate to get immigration reform done right away, because it's an expectation that we have, as long as other issues around economic and social justice. So I think that right now we got to focus on figuring out how we're going to win those 2 seats in Georgia. And the Democrats in the House need to do some reckoning as to who they really are. And don't blame the progressive wing of Ocasio-Cortez for the fact that centrist Democrats did lose their seats.
My own feeling is that there's some conversation like that has to go on in both parties, of how do you keep in a big tent or umbrella or whatever metaphor you use, people who are more moderate but mean to or think of themselves as Democrats or Republicans, and people who are more progressive or conservative, however you find it, so that a party can be a majority party and still be something that is speaks to all the people they're trying to put into their majority. And I think, so for Tom Kean Jr. to run in New Jersey, could somebody like that run in New Jersey differently with different views than Mitch McConnell in Missouri or something like that? But it's similar. The flip side of the points you're raising. I wanted to one of the comments was that we should, send a shout out or acknowledge Geraldine Ferraro, who was the first woman to be on a major party ticket for vice president in 1984. It's only taken, 36 years until we now have a woman elected vice president. Other thoughts and comments?
Hey, John, in terms of what you just mentioned, I think we're going to see next year what the state Republican Party is about, because you're going to have probably a pretty clear decision between, he's not in the race yet, but everyone believes that John Bramnick is going to get in, and he's been quite vocal in terms of his criticism of Donald Trump. And then you've got Jack Ciattarelli, who supported Trump. He is already in, former state legislator, and most likely Doug Steinhardt, the Republican chairman for the state. The state party has backed Donald Trump. So there could be a very clear choice there, for Republicans to see which arm they're going to support. So certainly that would be interesting. And I don't think we expect to see any challenge to Phil Murphy, despite you know, some of the issues that we saw in the beginning of the Murphy administration about, you know, his, let's just say tensions between him and Steve Sweeney, the Senate president in particular. So next year's gubernatorial campaign is going to be interesting, as it always is.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm surprised it's taken us an hour and 10 minutes to get to that topic. But that is one of the next political stories in New Jersey will be, and nationally will be that race here and the governor's race in Virginia.
I do want to just echo what Dr. Campos said about the progressives, and I think the relationship that the progressives will have with Biden, and not necessarily blaming the squad. I think there's a difference between progressives and the progressive movements that happened in 2016, where it was a brand new idea to the masses. It's always been there. I mean, you know, raising the minimum wage is always there, you know. But I think it will be, I don't think folks will necessarily start blaming or putting the finger to the squad or the progressives once Joe Biden comes in and has these debates with them and policy starts coming through. I think it's, I think with the, with everyone sitting down at the table and discussing this, the Democratic umbrella will definitely expand, and you will see that these are going to be becoming the norms, because the issues that progressives do fight for are the basis of the is the foundation of the Democratic Party. And so I think not only will the House with, and hopefully the Senate, of relationship with the president will change, and policies will change for the better, but the DNC and how things progress and policies within the Democratic Party in itself will definitely change and shift to more of a left ideology, if that makes sense. But
Let me ask you, Nabila, I don't know if you're comfortable answering this at all, but do you have any sense of, or can you give us a sense of what's happening in the Biden transition world for the next 5 days while you're on the staff and thereafter?
So no idea. My job was just to deliver Jersey to Biden, and I think we've done it really well, and to push our energy to battleground states. I think the transition team, they're figuring it out on their own internally first, but they want to hit the ground running. So he's doing policy. For instance, yesterday he released his task force for COVID. So what that looks like, I don't have the inside scoop for that. But I know that they're focusing on the, you know, just structuring and having a strong foundation for January 20th.
Okay.
So John, could I go back to Colleen's remark about, you know, next year in 21? I actually believe that, you know, economic issues are going to come to the forefront. And I think, you know, as we saw in the other states, you know, personal opinions don't always come out in the polls. So it won't be quite obvious, I think, what the electorate is feeling. And I believe it's going to be in both parties. You know, who can really make the case, especially if our unemployment stays relatively high. As I said, it's 6.7% now. If we don't attract jobs and we don't, you know, address the cost of living in New Jersey, I think it'll cross both parties, and it'll be who really has a better plan in 21 and can bring that, you know, to the voters.
Regina makes a good point. Sorry, go ahead, Patricia.
No, quickly, one thing that we ought to elevate is that part of the success of Biden and Harris, electoral success this time around, is that immediately after Bernie Sanders dropped as a political candidate, he was able to bring the Sanders team into the negotiations of what the platform will look like. So if you looked at the platform of Joe Biden in terms of some of the economic issues that the public care about, some elements of the progressive agenda were already in that agenda. And I think that as they're planning right now the transition, there's that collaboration is still very clear happening between the Biden team, who is, you know, who was supposedly more, you know, more traditional, more old school, and the progressive team that Sanders was able to keep energized. I think that's the difference. I mean, he never unwavered in his support for Biden, but he kept pushing for some of the elements of his campaign around economic policy, around issues of workers, around issues of investment in the Green New Deal. So I think that those elements were strategic in keeping the coalition that Biden was able to use to succeed. And I think we will see that moving forward. And there's a great opportunity to change the focus of Washington in terms of how they're going to tackle the economic recovery that we need to be able to get the economy going, that focuses on working people. However, we cannot do the economic recovery without actually having some leadership on the pandemic and the health crisis. So I think he'll start there, but I do think there's going to be a mesh between progressive core issues around economic reforms, a mesh with the influence that a Biden team has in terms of more traditional power spaces in Congress.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, in my mind, progressives in New Jersey, as regards to 2021, they're going to be all in for Murphy because he has delivered on progressive items for sure. But to the broader point of the 2021 election, New Jersey will elect Republicans. I mean, I think that Christie is an indicator of that, obviously. But going into 21, if the economy is not, I want to say radically, but significantly improved, no matter what the progressive elements in the party do for the incumbent, he is going to face a tough challenge. But also Republicans have to kind of go through their process of figuring out who they are. That's going to be really important into 2021. Somebody was touting Mike Testa, who's really quickly becoming a mouthpiece for the conservative elements of the Republican Party in New Jersey as a candidate for governor already. So I think you'll have 4 or 5 people who decide that they want to run for governor on the Republican side. And for us, that's good for business because it gives us an opportunity to dissect where they're all coming from. But one last note on polls, because we've talked a lot about polls leading up to and coming out of last Tuesday, is that there's a reckoning now on polls as well, I think that we all have to have. And it's how it is that we use these polls, how it is that we see these polls, and what it is that they really reflect. I think most of us, we see polls as, oh, here's where the horse race is at this time. But as I talked to more pollsters over the last month, really, they emphasize that it shouldn't be about what the numbers are, plus or minus 4 or 5 points in the margin of error, but what it is that those numbers reflect as the mindset of the people in the state at that time. And I think that when, and I say we, I mean the general consumer, that we think about the numbers all the time, but not what those numbers reflect and what they represent. And I think as we go forward, we as consumers should again start to see beyond what the numbers are, the raw numbers in a race, 48% to 43%, et cetera, and see what issues are driving the electorate at that particular moment. And I think that is much more informative to us as consumers of this data. And that's really important going forward as well.
But then, you know, I think the pollsters need, when they send out their press releases summarizing their polls, to not say in the lead, this poll shows that so-and-so is, you know, has gained. I mean, and that's, you know, all of us, you know, journalism is struggling, as we've said before, and I think everybody knows there are fewer reporters, people are more taxed. That doesn't, I mean, I don't want to make excuses, but when you don't have a lot of time, you read the poll, you read the lead of the poll, and you say, okay, this is where we're going with it. So I think they need to kind of change the way they're
Yeah, for
selling
sure.
their info.
Right. Well, I think we've put a lot of issues on the table. There are a lot of questions obviously that merit a lot more discussion over the next days, weeks, and months. And polling is high on that list. And other questions that people brought up in the Q&A that we're not going to get to. I just want to mention two closing things. And one is, and this is probably more coincidence than data, but in New Jersey for governor, ever since 1992, we've picked the governor of the party who isn't the president. Every time there's been a presidential election, Bill Clinton got elected and then Christie Whitman won the next year. So that might give Republicans some optimism or a window or something going to next year. The other point is just turnout, is that across the country and in New Jersey, the fact that turnout was so much higher than I think it's ever been is noteworthy, both in terms of civics and in terms of strategizing for candidates and parties that want to move forward. Anything else anyone wants to add?
I just also want to give the Republicans some more hope. It's not since Brendan Byrne in 1976 that a Democrat has won two terms as governor. So, you got some history there.
It's true.
I also want to elevate that I was actually very pleased to see the level of participation in this election in terms of vote by mail and how that process actually worked and people really participated. And I say that because I was really concerned as to what it will mean for urban working class communities, whether they will understand how to go about it. And it just goes to show that there was a lot of education at the grassroots level to do that. So we will see more vote by mail elections next year, but we will not have the national attention on an election. So that might have a drop in participation. So that will be impact turnout also for the gubernatorial race. But I think it was a good run in terms of vote by mail in New Jersey. We're still counting, but the level of participation was impressive. Can we make that happen in a gubernatorial race? I think that's still a question, and we have to do a lot of work to continue to educate working class voters about how to go about it. Because I think if you're as educated middle upper class, you will vote by mail. This time around, we will see how that functions next year.
Yeah, it's a good point, because it's one thing to increase the different ways that people can vote, but it's important to get people to increase or find a rationale for voting, even when it's not the presidential race or the governor's race. People, it's great if you can vote by mail or even from your phone on your local city council race, because that's where you start to see the most impact on your lives, is paving the streets and providing business opportunities downtown and so on. That's the level at which people need to begin to participate, and then expand out, county, state, and federal.
Again, thank you all for being here this morning and for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And we didn't answer all the questions, so we'll keep talking. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having us. Great.
Good to see all you guys. Thank you.
See everybody.
Good to see you.